Hey Mohan, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks, man.
So I got to know E27 when I was looking around, like to find, in US we have TechCrunch, in India there is, Inc. 42 and Your Story, which are like focused on, covering startups, tech, and venture capital. And then I realized, I'm also interested in other ecosystems, whether it's Israel, South Korea, or Singapore and Southeast Asia in general. And then I was like
Yeah.
actively searching for, you know, companies that are actually covering these spaces. And that's how I first actually encountered E27. And then I also started, whenever I write a blog post, I try to submit it to E27 as well. And that's how I, got to know you. So I was obviously curious, what you guys are doing at E27 and, the various things that you're doing in terms of angel investing, and also super curious about what's happening in Southeast Asia in general. But before talking, all those things, can you give the audience a brief overview of, what is E27 and what are all the different things that you do?
I think I'm appreciative that you're using E27 to learn more about the Southeast Asia ecosystem. So E27 was started back in 2012. It had an earlier history as a community in university, but it really started as a company in 2012 where we wanted to bring the tech ecosystem together. We wanted to connect the ecosystem together, and we started by using media and events as the way to get that going. Right? A lot of our ideas and inspirations were with what was happening in the US. So we were like looking at what TechCrunch was doing and all of that, and content in terms of covering what was happening in the ecosystem, and events like whether it's meetups or small conferences was how we kickstarted things. Over time, as we engaged the ecosystem, and it got a bit more complicated, right? We started, looking at databases. So we have now a startup and investor database, about 35,000 startups, close to 2,000 investors. We started doing jobs as community related value offerings, right? But the one thing that really stuck with us was the conference that we did called the Echelon, right? It was meant to really mimic what TechCrunch 50 was like, but it ended up becoming a beast of its own, right? Like the largest one back in 2019 was at 10,000 people. And what it really did is bring together the fragmented Southeast Asia ecosystem, because Southeast Asia is made up of many different countries, right? The key ones are the top six, right? And you've got localized ecosystems, and you've got localized networks. And we really wanted to be the platform that brought the entire Southeast Asia ecosystem together, because
What are
we
the
we
countries
deeply
you're talking about when you say Southeast Asia and top six
yeah.
countries?
So the primary countries was Singapore, Indonesia, Philippines, Vietnam, Thailand, and Malaysia. And these continue to be the dominant top Southeast Asia countries. Um, the the view, and which is still relevant now, is that if you want to build a billion-dollar company in this region, you have to be in all of these markets, or you at least have to have a presence in multiple of these markets. And the clearest example that I think the global community would know would be Grab and C Group, right? They are in all around Southeast Asia. C Group is definitely a bit more global, but Grab is like the dominant Southeast Asian. But of course, COVID happened, and we had to completely stop events. So we pivoted to do a lot more of what we originally wanted to do, which is business matching, matchmaking startups, investors, and corporates, and those kind of things. So today we're a platform that provides connection and business matching services for startups, corporates, and investors. And we've done like over 15,000 matchmaking connections on our platform alone.
And how do you measure these connections? I'm assuming these are like investor startup connections.
Yeah. So we have like a connect feature similar to LinkedIn, but we do a two-way model where if a startup wants to connect with an investor, the investor will get access to the data room, information about the company and why the connection wants to happen, and they have to opt into the connection as well. Uh, we do a lot of programs with corporates as well. So we work with SAP, Salesforce, Facebook, Zoom, just to name a few, where we actively would matchmake them with companies. They typically have a program. It could be a funding program or a product or an accelerator, or even in some case, some funds. And we will matchmake them based on the data we have to companies that are the right size or right sector in the right region that they want to target.
So I want to talk a little bit about the business side of E27 and like what is the scale of the business and what is the business model behind E27, because media businesses are usually, even though like there are two sides of media business, it's very attractive to run a business for the outsiders, but when insiders are actually running it, what I feel is they're not actually that great of a businesses in the in the larger scheme of things. For example, we only have very few media companies left globally, even in US, like Vox and a couple of other media networks, and they operate because they're a combination of businesses and just not TechCrunch doesn't open their own. It's owned by a larger, bigger company. And that consolidation happens because eventually people realize that these are low margin businesses. And I mean, so what is the scale of E27 right now, and sort of what is the business model behind it?
So you're right in a lot of ways with respect to media businesses being challenging to grow, right? And that's why in the early days, a lot of our focus for monetization was around events, and we did really well, right? Because there were only a few events of a significant scale in Southeast Asia, and we were one of them, right? So you could get like 60-70% margins on events alone, and these were of course 6-figure events, right? Regionally. So the original business model for a lot of the media companies, especially in tech, was events, and it's a model that worked very well. Now that model started getting disrupted because as the Southeast Asia tech ecosystem grew, a lot of governments wanted to do events as well. And when governments do events, they typically don't charge, whether it's for exhibition space. The sponsorship they take are typically from similar government-linked companies, so there's no aspect of P&L for them, right? So that disruption was significant and challenging, but it was still a viable model, right? There was an inflection point, I think, sometime around 2016, 2017, where because of the complexity of the ecosystem, visibility started becoming challenging, right? So in order for VCs, in order for corporates, in order for some of the larger companies to stand out, they were now willing to pay for branding, they were willing to pay for thought leadership content, and those kind of things. So that really helped build a content marketing business for us, which continues to be a large part of our revenue channel actually today. Some media companies also do go down the path of like I would say maybe what I would term as corporate consulting services. So these could be bespoke campaigns or bespoke accelerator programs. We've also seen some do reports and data, although that have been I think a lot less successful as you might think compared to the US. Like for example, CB Insights does a really good business with data, but I think Southeast Asia that's a lot more challenging. I think subscriptions have also started to take off here, and you've got like the Nikkeis and all of that doing subscription businesses. But for us, the model that has worked really well is a mix of content marketing, thought leadership campaigns, corporate consulting, also our subscription business.
Moving on, the events thing that you brought out is interesting because I've heard one of the most profitable things in most media companies is actually events. And like I think events sort of because now everything is up on the internet and there's so many meetups and it's easy to organize an events. I feel like the events which are actually working are either branded events that already built on like 10-15 years of legacy, like the TechCrunch Disrupt or Recode Media, the Recode Decode events, which is called Code Conference, where Steve Jobs famously did the Red Chair interviews. So other than that, there are highly exclusive curated events which often work. So when you think about your own, I think, flagship event, Echelon, is that now sort of like one of the flagship events in Southeast Asia, or you're trying to make it one, or where is that in terms of events as a strategy?
Yeah, so you're right. I think in Southeast Asia at least, right, and similarly in the US, as the space started getting more mature, the types of events also started getting more varied, right? So you would have smaller invite-only events. You would have events that were catered to very particular verticals, and I think that helped get smaller event brands standing out. In 29, Echelon was definitely one of the flagship events. Only event that had a main summit in Singapore and like a regional roadshow all across the region. And I mean, in a way, that was like our secret sauce. And what made it particularly challenging was the fact that we would travel to about 12 cities all across APAC, including as far as Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Australia, Taiwan, Japan, Korea. We would engage the startup ecosystems and the investor ecosystems in these markets. And hence, the corporates that would sponsor us, that would join our platforms, right, were willing to pay extra, right, to get that regional exposure. So in that sense, we were probably the most regional, on the ground event brand in Southeast Asia. Now, of course, the challenge, of course, with COVID, is that it wiped out all the events for a while. We were one of the few companies that actually made a conscious effort not to jump to virtual events. And I think for me, I remember in early February, I told my co-founder that while everyone was postponing events, because COVID wasn't really that certain at that point in time, how big of an impact it would be, I told my co-founder that we would completely cancel events and as far as possible not bring it back. Because I felt that that model was a huge limitation to the growth of our business. And interestingly, we are actually doing a smaller version of Echelon in late October this year. And part of the reason is because our clients have come back to us and requested for it. Part of the reason is because we want to have a deeper face-to-face touch point with our community. And we also want to kind of support the government's efforts to open up. But events used to be the key revenue driver in the organization, and today it has completely shifted, right? So I think for us at least, that's a positive step in the business model.
One of the things that happens when you're either running a media company or just events, or where if you're in I call this as a super router as a term, like if you are a super router, like all things are passing through you. Like if you're running a media company or a blog or a pretty good podcast, or running a lot of events and you're hosting events, what you end up becoming is actually a super router. Like a lot of things that are happening around, right? So the natural extension, I guess, which you did as well, because you've seen so much startups, is angel invest. And I consider, I think you are super router in probably the Southeast Asian space, considering you are running E27. Was that a trigger to start angel investing? Like, what was that first motivation towards angel investing?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, right? Like, so my angel investing journey started in 2013. And I started with the route of investing in funds because at that point in time, I mean, from a capital allocation standpoint, it made more sense for me to go through the funds route and have a more diversified portfolio while also learning how the angel investing game works. So that was on a personal level, right? It just made sense for me since I'm in the ecosystem and I should invest in it. But on a business level, in the early days, we didn't feel like starting a fund or doing angel investment activities would be beneficial to the business in the early days, because we wanted to be that community, to provide that platform for the VCs, right? So when looking back, it felt like we were potentially competing with that community. Um, we were going to actually start getting more active in the angel investment space through syndicates starting 2020. So 2019 as a company, we did fairly well. We were profitable. We had figured out the model to be cash flow positive and profitable. And hence 2020 was the year where we were going to start launching syndicates and then work towards a fund. But unfortunately, we, with the hit of COVID, we had to completely shift our focus to making the business sustainable in a different way, right? But 2021 ended up being our best year ever because a lot of the pivots that we did worked out really well. And there was a massive resurgence of companies that wanted to invest or work with startups in 2021. Kickstarted my angel investment journey personally again in 2018. And the interesting thing is between 2018 and 2013, the ecosystem had grown so much that my 10 to 15K checks, that were valuable in 2013 were no longer valuable because founders would have like minimum of 50K check requirements, or you would get deals done really, really quickly with founders that were a bit more networked. And capital had become a lot more of a commodity. So I started doing more SPVs and syndicate investments, right, on a personal level. And I started working with other syndicates as well to do deals together. And that really led me to meet my current partner, Milan. And over whiskey, right, we were talking about the angel investment landscape and realized that we had very similar challenges in angel investing, but also very similar ambitions, which was to start an early stage seed fund. A lot of seed funds were active in the early days, but as their funds grew, we felt that there was a gap in the seed stage investment in Southeast Asia, and specifically a seed stage fund that had a network of founders and operators that could really help scale companies, right? Comparatively speaking, right, in the early days of the tech ecosystem for Southeast Asia, a lot of the ideas were backed by founder visions or trust that the founders had, and models that were based off like companies in China or the US. But today, thanks to the last 10 years, you've got a much more reliable data set of how companies can scale in the region. You've got founders that have worked multiple years in fast-growing tech companies, so they have a clear idea of how to get it done. And you've also got investors that had personally built companies themselves, so they knew how to really support founders. And that's how Orwell Ventures got started, right? We wanted to build a network-based seed venture fund to help early stage founders get to the Series A level.
You mentioned, I think you touched upon this a little bit, but I want to go a little bit deeper. So, for example, if I go back to like 2016 or 2015, and since I invest more in US, India, and other places, like India VC ecosystem in 2016 was much different than 2019, and now way different in 2021. So 2016 was like an era where you have these big companies like Flipkart and Zomato, but you haven't had exits. You haven't had really the flow of capital like we are seeing right now or in the past 2.5, 3 years. And partly that is, I think there's a macro phenomenon that happened also in the last 2 years. So India sort of, a rising tide shifts all boats, sort of a scenario for India. And I feel like a certain amount of truth exists for Southeast Asia as well in that sense. Where is Southeast Asia startup ecosystem right now? Like if you like chart out last 10, 12 years, and what are the main companies around which like whose ex-founders are starting to build and like fund? Because one of the things in startups that happens is, for example, in India, like every pre-seed stage company you go, it's a 50-50 chance that Kunal Shah is an early stage investor, right? Because he believes in startups. He got an exit out of his startup, and he's a big believer in funding startups. So, and this is usually the case in early startup ecosystems everywhere else, right? And I feel like your story is also partly of that. That you are a successful founder, even though it's not, a tech outcome, but it's still a great, tech publication, which is a sustainable company that you're building. And now you're at a position that you can do seed investments through Orwell Ventures or writing small checks or connecting more VCs. So just give the audience a little bit of context of where Southeast Asia as a VC ecosystem is right now, VC and startup ecosystem.
Okay, wow, that's a huge question. So let's see. Okay, so let's take a step back and understand first how the ecosystem started on the venture side, right? The early days of the venture ecosystem in Singapore was heavily modeled over the Israeli Yosma Fund model, where the Singapore government would do an 85-15 program. So companies, VCs would put up 15% of the capital, and then the government would put up 85% of the capital, and this would be like a $500,000 round. And then I believe there was a way for VCs to buy back the capital. So the early days of venture in Singapore was driven by government-led incentives to bring in investors, right? And I think that really kick-started things well, because it reduced the capital requirements for VC funds to start investing, and it also kind of help share the risk with a lot of the VCs, right? So that was stage one, and then at some point, right, there was the growth of smaller funds that had been either where partners from the US and one partner from Singapore, or from India and Singapore. So the few examples would be Golden Gate Ventures, which I was an investor in Fund 1. Vinny was a successful founder in the US. Jeffrey was a successful founder here. They raised their first fund, which I believe was a $10 million fund, ended up doing really well. And these were very founder-centric funds. Then you had multiple of others too, right? The Jungle Ventures. And then at every stage of the venture ecosystem, right, there's always that, okay, there's a Series A cap, or there's a Series B cap, right? So bit by bit, right, I think the government tried to figure out ways to help incentivize investors, because it was always a chicken and egg issue, right? To build the venture ecosystem. So some of it was through government-led funds in certain sectors that they believe was important. So, for example, a deep tech sector. So they had this fund called Seeds Capital, where they would do matching investments. In some cases, it was them running private funds of their own. So it took some time for the organic venture community to start building shape, right? And then I believe there was a tipping point somewhere around 2015, 2016, right? Where there were where there were a lot more family offices, there were a lot more corporates that had started to take an interest in wanting to invest in early stage startups. One of the more well-known funds today, for example, which is a Vertex Venture Fund, they were a much longer fund, which was a link to Temasek and all that, but they were also the first Series A fund in Grab. So that was also a period where I think older funds in the sector had started to, I would say, maybe rebrand or relook at tech investing. Because tech investing in Singapore specifically, I started very heavily from a more research and even biomedical sciences standpoint. But ICT, which is the terminology they use for internet companies, right, really started to, I think, take off as a sector for a lot of these older funds in 2015, 2016. Right? And then over time, as the ecosystem started getting more mature, family offices, which is actually, I would say, from 2018, 2019 onwards, family offices and corporates started to launch CVCs, right? Corporate venture capital funds, right? Now, this was a lot more prevalent in markets like Thailand and to some level Indonesia, where the VC ecosystem wasn't as developed, right? But if you look at the VC ecosystem in Indonesia now, it's significantly gotten larger. And this was also the period where more localized funds started popping up. So previous funds were more regional. So if you started a Southeast Asia fund, by default, you would look at the whole region. But 2016 onwards, you started to have more localized funds. So East Ventures, Alpha JWC, Kajora Ventures. These were some of the Convergence Ventures. These were some of the more localized Indonesia-centric funds that really started focusing on the local Indo market. The big success story for Indonesia, of course, was the investment into Gojek, the early investment into Gojek by North Star, right? And I think that really catapulted the entire tech investment in Indonesia. And then, of course, that led to many other funds popping up and starting to focus on that particular sector. And today, you've got a very complex network of investors because through the exits that have happened in the ecosystem, you have angel syndicates that have popped up. So there are multiple in the region, right? There's Ascend Angels that Milan, my partner, used to run. And these are mostly made up of founders and operators. There's Angel Central that is run by Shaoning and Tershing, who were formerly very successful founders themselves. And then you've got, for example, XA Network, which is a network of ex-Googlers. So typically executives from these kind of networks. So Angel Syndicates has been one of the big shifts in the venture investment community over the last few years. You also have what I call the unicorn clubs. So as you know, as companies like Tokopedia, Kopi Kenangan, you know, the Gojek, as these companies have scaled, a lot of the founders and senior operators in the companies have also started investment clubs and private investment funds of their own, right? So that like in summary, right, I think the Southeast Asia venture community today is a very complex structure of VCs, angel investments, corporate venture funds, and family offices.
In other words, it's pretty thriving right now. Since you're one of the super routers, I mean, it makes sense, you know, for me, just outside looking in, for you to start a fund, because one of the biggest challenges first-time fund managers face is how do you create a good inbound deal flow? And I think you already solved that problem, you know, being in the ecosystem in one way or the other. But when you see opportunity, right? Because last 2 years, particularly, I think globally, venture has been weird in a lot of ways. That there's, you know, obscene rounds, there's crypto, which is taking, you know, obscene amounts of capital without, I don't know if we have really actually found a use case, or, you know, without proof of product. And, you know, there's Tiger Global, which is, you know, which sort of made waves both in India and Southeast Asia. I don't know if it made as much waves in Southeast Asia, but definitely in India and US. So when you see all this, and when you're a first-time fund manager starting a fund, where do you see the opportunity for your fund, and as a, you know, as a GP / founder of the fund?
Yeah, I mean, the other major issue is not just like Tiger Global, crypto, and SoftBank. I wouldn't call it an issue, but the other major thing is also YC, right? Like, so YC started accepting more and more Southeast Asia fund companies in the last few years, and this the entrance into YC alone has significantly jacked up the valuations, right, for founders. Yeah. So I think that is also another interesting issue. But that has started to change, right? Because I've met YC founders now that are a bit more pragmatic in their valuations, and they also realize, right, that you know, raising capital at a significant valuation today could, you know, impact them down the road, right, if they aren't able to get the growth numbers to justify the future valuation. So the last few years, yes, has been pretty crazy from a valuation standpoint. This is more prevalent in Indonesia actually, where because of the natural interest in the market, because of the competition among the venture firms, and because of the success by the early companies, the Grabs, the Gojeks, Tokopedias, and all that, the valuations started getting very significant. We haven't seen a significant drop in valuations. When I say significant, like I mean like really like 50% drop in the last couple of years, and even this year, right? Because I think on some level, founders are also raising seed rounds now with a lot more traction, with a lot more sophistication in their go-to-market plans, and also the ARR numbers to back it up, right? So, for example, we're looking at a company in Vietnam that's built like the Audible of Vietnam, doing $1 million in ARR revenue, raising at a 10 million valuation, right? Which is a very fair multiple in even in today's world, and the founder has a very clear pathway to 10x that revenue multiple. And these are the kind of interesting deals that we're starting to see at Orwell. We've also started to see, like a lot of our thesis is also based on backing non-first-time founders, because we feel that Southeast Asia is a complex enough market that you need to have either done it before, or you need to have been involved in a fast-growing tech startup previously to be knowing what you're doing, right? The thing with Southeast Asia today is that there are already dominant players in a lot of the large sectors. So if you look at consumer marketplaces, if you look at car marketplaces, if you look at B2B SaaS, there are dominant players in a lot of these verticals, and there are also dominant players that acquisitions have happened or exits have happened, right? So the challenge, I think, for investors in Southeast Asia is to start looking at, okay, what are the future verticals in the next 10 years? What are the major problems that are going to exist in Southeast Asia that founders and startups need to solve and tackle? And how can they back founders now? And for me, right, I think that a lot of these opportunities lie in health tech. So health tech is, for example, a sector that I've personally been investing in in the last few years. But a lot of my investments in the sector have been in the US, some in India, maybe only one in Southeast Asia. And I think a lot more can be done there. Because Southeast Asia's diaspora is unique enough that very specific health tech companies can be built to target this market. And Orwell is actually looking at a company, interestingly, in Thailand of all markets, right? Because the health tech infrastructure in markets like Thailand, Vietnam, Philippines are completely different from those in the US or Singapore, right? So I think the opportunity is this, right? Like there are the next wave of major sectors and verticals that the first wave didn't look at, that this wave is going to start looking.
In terms of rounds, are you focused on pre-seed, seed, Series A? What type of investments are you looking at in that sense?
Yeah, so the ideal sector that we focus on is seed at a valuation that is at sub 10 million, because our target percentage ownership is 1%, right? And for us, traction or a very clear go-to-market plan is important, right? So we're not at a level of like pre-seed or angel where where the companies are still figuring out their product market fit or the prototype level. I think for Orwell, there has to be a bit more clarity in their go-to-market plan, and also this, right, like the network VC, the network that we have in terms of the E27 network and the Angels network that Ascend Angels has, they are only effective or can be put to work once the founder has a very clear pathway and clear scaling plan, right? But if he or she is in the product market fit sector, then the network-based VC model will not be useful for them.
Yeah, I've always felt that, if you focus your thesis, and there are only few people who can, follow this thesis, and the thesis is just invest in second-time founders in a, growing market like India or Southeast Asia, because that's a huge advantage, because a lot of, interesting companies that came out of India, for example, you see, are all second-time founders who had almost like a bad or good or sort of an average exit, and they had that one more company, and now the ecosystem is so vibrant and ready for ideas, and the times have changed, the internet adoption has changed. So I always had this thesis that you just back second time founders, but the problem usually comes is that unless you're in the ecosystem for a while and you have that trust in the ecosystem, you can't really get into those deals. So that is actually the problem with that thesis, is only some people can actually execute that thesis, and I think you're in the right position to execute that thesis. So I think I think you slightly hinted on that idea that we want to back, second time founders.
I completely agree, right? And you see, you are right. See, first, see the interesting thing about the founder network now is that 10 years ago, right, founders would take capital from anyone, and today founders talk among themselves, right? Like, who should they not take capital from? Who should they not work with? I literally had a founder ping me a couple of weeks back doing due diligence check on an investor, checking whether they should raise capital from that particular investor. And it is a very, so that's why I mentioned earlier, right? The capital part is a commodity these days, right? How investors back founders, how they work with founders, the value proposition they can provide, and how they support founders is very critical now. And I mean, I would say that I've been in a very privileged and thankful position to have worked with many founders in the early days, right? Like, I mean, not to brag, right? But I literally got an email from a founder yesterday who said that in 2015, thanks to him attending an Echelon event and winning the event, he quit his corporate job, started a company, and they actually just sold the company. The announcement came out this week, right? So I honestly think if you want to invest in startups, you have to be genuine with helping founders in the first place, right? And in order to care for founders and their challenges, you kind of also have to be a founder yourself. And in 2020, right, interestingly, right, I spend most of my time helping the founders in my portfolio just deal with the day-to-day pain and problems of dealing with investors, dealing with employees, dealing with shifting market sentiment and uncertainty, a lot more than just helping them with capital raising, right? So I'm a huge believer of founders investing in founders, founders supporting founders, and I'm privileged to be able to do this. And yeah, I would want to continue to back good founders.
I think that's an amazing story and also a great point to end the podcast on. Mohan, really appreciate you coming onto the podcast.
No, thanks for having me. Right? I mean, I'm always reminding my team also at E27 that we won't exist without a great ecosystem. So I'm always mindful and respectful of the fact that all of us are just tiny contributors to this larger tech ecosystem, and as long as we can contribute in our little way to make Southeast Asia, India, and solve the big problems that we have, and improve the lives of people in that process through startups, it will continue to be something I will put my heart and soul into doing.
Thank you.